Media recognition from Bloomberg, Reuters, recycling trade publications. Patented process for 100% recovery of critical metals, including cobalt, lithium, nickel, manganese, aluminum. American Manganese is focused on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. American Manganese trades on the TSX Venture, AMY, the US, AMYZF, and Frankfurt 2AM. For more information, visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Stewart Muir, Executive Director of the ResourceWorks Society. His website, resourceworks.com. You can find him on Twitter at SJ Muir. Welcome back to the show, Stewart.
Thank you, Jim.
Stewart, you found, first of all, we'll talk about logging and forestry in British Columbia, one of the province's biggest industries. What's new there, and what kind of an impact will this new thing have on jobs and local economies?
Yes, well, the BC government has announced plans. It's a little bit nuanced, but basically they're saying to the forest industry, we want you to close down up to 22 sawmills and pulp and paper mills. We want you to take out 20,000 jobs because, and wait for it, an advisory group that the BC government itself created and stacked with anti-forestry lobbyists, 4 out of 5 seats on that group, told them to do that. And they've gone ahead and done it. It's actually one of the more outrageous things I've ever seen in, 40 years of covering BC politics.
Does this mean the death knell for some small communities?
Oh, it most certainly does. I've been speaking to people in Port McNeill, for example, northern Vancouver Island. There's a heavily forest-reliant community. It'll be toast if the worst excesses of this advisory panel are realized.
Now, what does, of course, the government says this is just a proposal right now, not law, but what are the odds of this becoming the law?
Well, I think with the current conditions that we have, a majority government that has got a certain amount of sort of green influence on its caucus. You know, it's split between Labour and the Greens and kind of the social people who want to improve, you know, the benefits that people receive, the poor receive, that kind of thing. It is a government with a spectrum of different interest groups as we see. And here's an instance where the eco or the green wedge of the party has taken over a particularly important process. I mean, forestry in BC is 1/3 of the export economy. It's 18% of the BC economy. And they're saying, you know what, we don't really care about that anymore. Let's take it out. I mean, that's not everyone in the BC government. And I know there's lots of MLAs who actually do understand that there are working people in well-paying jobs. These are mortgage-paying jobs that support whole families, that they're just saying, let's get rid of them. We don't need them anymore. But for those who are in those jobs and in those communities, they have a very different perspective, not surprisingly.
Now, of course, you have the image of that logging truck carrying that giant ancient log down the highway. That's a hard image to fight. What can the logging community do to say that's not what we're all about?
Well, yeah. I mean, that particular tree, once you actually get into the facts of it, it's not at all what the image is. But the image is the image picked up around the world. I mean, that was a tree that was maybe 400 years old. It was a Sitka spruce, which tend to grow in the more boggy ground, and they have a habit of not living past 450 years or so because they literally fall over in high winds. And the oldest specimen that anyone has ever found is 450 years old, and it's on the Olympic Peninsula to the south of us. In Washington State. So the fact that that tree is near that age, I mean, it was headed for, you know, some sort of fate like that. It might even be the case that it blew down and then it was, sectioned out to be turned into things like guitar tops, which is why it was on a truck. But anyways, the image is what it is, and people see that and sort of, they have this, emotional reaction that isn't necessarily a rational reaction. But the fact is the forest industry in BC is probably the most responsible in the world in terms of having regulations. You know, just to cut down a single tree, we've counted more than 100 bureaucratic steps because everyone has to be consulted. Biologists have to be consulted, and professional forest scientists and First Nations, all these different interest groups and cogs in the bureaucratic wheel of forest approvals have to be consulted. Nothing gets done that isn't approved by all of those. When forests are replanted, because we don't deforest unless you're talking about, building a new subdivision in Surrey or something. We don't deforest the forest. We reforest in BC, and that's a very crucial distinction, because as soon as something is harvested in a cut block, and a cut block typically these days, it wasn't like this in the past, but it is now, it's about the size of your average golf course. I mean, maybe that is big if you're standing there with a golf club, but it's not really that big in terms of the landscape and the scale of the valleys and the places where BC forest people operate. So everything is of the highest standard today, and it's renewable, and it's friendly for the climate. The idea that forestry is somehow, and I've seen this attached to the climate summit in Glasgow, the idea that forestry is bad for the climate is, when it's done properly, the reverse is true, because what you're doing is harvesting trees that will die and release carbon, and you're turning the product, before that happens, into something that humans use and is sequestered, and then you're planting new trees that then grow and suck up the carbon from the air as they grow. There can be regional differences in how that operates and exceptions to that for sure, but generally speaking, a growing plant absorbs the carbon from the air. So we want more of that, right? If we're serious about climate, and I think we're serious about climate, even though the scale of the problem is so monumental, we have to do thousands of little things, and reforestation is one of them.
What's the impact on First Nations communities that live in these logging areas?
Well, there's no ability that I have to speak for any First Nation. I can share the observation I have, which is from groups like the BC First Nations Forestry Alliance, which is a First Nations-based organization. Their reaction to that news last week was of, I think, outrage. They issued a news release. They were upset about it because no one consulted them. And also, the government put this 30-day consultation window on it. They said to First Nations, you've got 30 days to consider the demands that we've placed on the future forestry in your community. And I'm not sure they said exactly what they'll do after 30 days if that demand is not met, but it's a interesting deadline when you consider the chronic capacity constraints that many First Nations have. They don't have extensive analytical, bureaucratic people in place to deal with the mounds of applications and permits that cross their desk. It's really a struggle based on conversations I've had with many First Nations. They've got the resource department. Their job is to review things if someone wants to, do anything in agriculture and mining and in transportation, whatever it is. They have to consult First Nations. So here's one thing, the government's just thrown it on their desk. You got 30 days to deal with it. That's a pretty heavy ask, and I think a lot of First Nations have been expressing their concern about that. So I think that's probably the first thing that needs a reality check.
The government claims 4,400 jobs will be lost. That's like if you shut down Starbucks for a week. Is that a true picture of what's going to happen if this policy goes into place?
Well, the government was asked in the legislature of BC for its socioeconomic study, and they couldn't produce one. So it's unclear where that figure came from. And also we've seen the United Steelworkers, one of the biggest unions in the forest sector in British Columbia, come out to say, actually, no, it's about 4 times that big. We've seen the Council of Forest Industry say it's 4 or 5 times that big. So I don't think anyone is just accepting that figure at face value. Personally, when I look at it, I compare it to the devastation implied by what their Sierra Club-based group is advocating for. I think their number is very low as well.
The image in the public mind is 4,000-year-old trees are being felled in BC. Is that the case?
There's trees that reach a great age. Some trees, it's more common for trees to do what people do, which is to be born or sprout, to live and grow and mature and then get old and die. That's the life for most trees. There are certainly exceptions of these magnificent specimens that we see They're not defying age, but they are in conditions where they are able, because they're a species in a condition that's ideal for them to, to attain that great age. And I don't know anyone who doesn't think that such specimens of trees shouldn't be protected. In fact, last week I went out to the Fairy Creek area. I saw a specimen. It's popularly known. Many people may have heard of it. Big, lonely Doug. It's called lonely because there's this big Douglas fir called Doug that's sitting in the middle of a cut block from about a decade ago. And back when that was first cut, that area, there was a forester who said, you know what, that tree should be preserved. And it was preserved. It was not harvested. It had sat there in that spot for 500 years. The wind's blowing from off the Pacific. This is very close to the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Those winds howl through there, and a lot of trees of that size just get blown down. Big Lonely Doug is actually kind of damaged because of all that, but he survived. And now, 10 years later, even though there were kind of posters of Big Lonely Doug after the logging immediately took place, and it didn't look too pretty. But 10 years later, I walked down there last Wednesday, and I had a look. The trees that have been replanted, they're 15, 20 feet high. If you're standing at the base of the tree, 50 feet back, you can barely see Big Lonely Doug because the trees have grown up. That's regeneration, and those are actually Doug's own offspring from pine cones. So that was saved because a forester said, let's save that tree. That's why those trees are saved. It wasn't, the Greenpeace out there saying, if you don't protest that, we'll, shut down your highway. If you don't protect that, we'll shut down your highway. That's how the forest sector actually operates. Conservationists and foresters are one and the same, which I think is lost in these high volume campaigns where you've got these sort of, zero sum game attempts to frighten the public and force politicians to do things that are really actually not very good for conservation. They're not good for the public. They're not good for First Nations. Nobody wins.
If we're worried about the impact on the planet, what happens when you stop controlled, well-regulated logging in BC?
Well, one thing that happens is you don't have forest roads. Right now, the reason that people are able to go to places like Eden Grove, which is also near Fairy Creek, I walked among those trees last week, is beautiful. But to get there, you go on a forest road that's maintained by forest companies. They pay for that. It costs money. The local district, they have a fire hall. They have their main roads to look after. They have all these services for residents. They're not out there maintaining forest roads. The reason we have that kind of tourism is because we have a forest industry that's actively out there. Forestry is not about the day that a tree is cut down. Forestry is about the day a new tree is planted. It's about the maintenance of that area. It's about, thinning to make sure that there's a good regrowth going on. It's about retaining the old growth stands and the harvesting. And then after 40 or 50 or 60, 70 years of that, and then, yes, a tree is harvested. That's what forestry is about. It's not this idea of this rapacious industry. All it does is go in and cut down trees. That's not how it is. And so if we lose that, we lose tourism, we lose the jobs that come from this over decades and decades, and we lose all the other impacts from, the downtown office towers where the accountants and logistics people support forestry from the cities to the suburbs where the warehouses and the manufacturing and equipment repair takes place, all these places, and then finally all the revenues, huge revenues that go from forestry into the public purse to pay for our hospitals, schools, roads, all that stuff. Like, that's what the government is saying, you know what, we don't need any of that. Well, a lot of people would beg to differ on that point.
Would a lack of forestry roads make it harder to fight forest fires?
Oh, most definitely, yeah. And one of the principles of forest fires is you want to have ingress and egress for firefighters. You don't want to just send firefighters up to a valley, one-way road. They want to have a way out for their own safety. And when you've got, an industry that is maintaining access to areas, they're able to make sure that when these things happen, forest fires happen because of complex reasons. Top of mind, of course, right now is climate change, and that's definitely a factor. But there's other factors too, like the fact that we have artificially maintained the growth of forest fire fuel by not allowing nature to take its course, as it has for all time, until new modern methods of supposedly protecting the forest came along. So, we need to have a better, more nature-based methods of handling fire. and fuel. And forestry is part of that, in a positive way.
So, in other words, this could cost lives.
Oh, yes, it could. And communities, too. I mean, you've got examples of communities, especially in the interior, where we have the pine beetle kill and these whole areas that are aged and dry and just waiting to go up. You know, if you're a community in there, you know, you should be fearful of this. And there are many communities. You can pretty much map it out. I did a little exercise. I can tell you what communities will be subject to wildfires in the next few years. You can just see it on a map when you layer over where the burned out forests or the dried out forests are, the pine beetle kills. You know, that's where the fires are going to be. And if there's community there, they're going to have a fire problem. Do you want to thin that out through forestry? Well, darn right you do. And the smart ones, or the ones who are prioritizing this at present, are already managing that risk. And those who aren't are, unfortunately, setting themselves up. And, you know, they need help. I mean, people know that they're at risk. They may not have the resources they need to deal with that. And they can get those resources from a healthy forest industry.
We'll have more with Stewart Muir right after this.
Don't miss out. Stay informed. Receive the HowStreet.com weekly recap with thought-provoking podcasts, radio, and articles delivered to your inbox. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage at HowStreet.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Stewart Muir. Stewart, the very first thing Joe Biden did when he was elected was cancel the XL pipeline that would have carried Alberta oil down to the southern Gulf Coast of the U.S. But what's the White House doing now when it comes to oil?
Yeah, well, it's a crisis situation. President Biden is concerned that high gasoline prices will be uncomfortable for motorists, so he's asking OPEC to release more oil. OPEC doesn't want to do that because OPEC wants the money. You know, Iraq wants to monetize the oil it sells to the highest level it can. Why wouldn't they? So they're not going wild with production. So they're not listening to Biden. At the same time, Biden is telling the world what a climate champion he and the United States are, because they are pursuing different goals and have, you know, their new infrastructure plan and that kind of thing. It's pretty contradictory, isn't it, when you've got this? And they're also, you know, they're looking, at Canada. They're not really saying anything, but it's kind of obvious to anyone who, can connect the dots that the most realistic way for the United States to deal with its energy concerns is to turn to its neighbor Canada, because we have the reliable, affordable, accessible, stocks of oil that will solve all of their problems for the whole remainder of the energy transformation to that point we all want to get to and need to get to, where we're not producing emissions. You know, it's a kind of uncomfortable, strange moment to see this contradiction where Biden is sucking and blowing on this issue. I mean, here's how weird it is. I'm just reading in the Wall Street Journal today that White House officials have considered a suggestion that their national security advisor sent out a series of rapid-fire tweets slamming OPEC for not pumping more oil. Where did they get the idea from for that? They got it from President Donald Trump, who used that same tactic with some success when he was still president. So the day that the Biden White House starts lifting from the Trump playbook is a day when you say, whoa, has the world just turned upside down or what? So these contradictions are really strange.
Also, just getting back to forestry for half a second here, you mentioned in an email that you sent to me, if we stop sustainable, well-regulated logging in BC, what's the effect, say, in a place like South America or Southeast Asia, Indonesia, places like that?
Yeah, well, we've seen these distortions with oil. I mean, when there are measures to curb consumption through curbing production, invariably there's the effect that production just moves somewhere else. And that's true of oil and gas. It's also true of forestry. If responsibly harvested wood products, lumber from British Columbia isn't produced, the world will need to get those products from somewhere. The only places it can get that kind of product from are ones that are less environmentally high performance than British Columbia. I mean, it's axiomatic that based on all of the things we've gone through to improve our forest industry, you know, everyone wants to catch up with British Columbia. Yet in British Columbia, here we are, going through these acrobatics to get out of forestry. So anyways, what it's going to mean is that deforestation in the Amazon will accelerate because of these policies. This is typically it. I mean, we're seeing, again, the same thing in oil and gas. We've seen it in coal. So in coal, with divestment in the United States, good microcosm of this, there was divestment in coal mines. And so the big companies, the public companies that were subjected to divestment campaigns where activists said, you have to get out of coal. And those companies eventually said, yeah, okay, we'll get out of coal. And they sold it off. Well, what's happened? The companies that bought those coal mines have ramped up production. Same is happening in South Africa. And now the activists are wondering how this happened. Well, I could have told them. In fact, I was telling them years ago that this would happen. It has happened. It'll happen with forestry too. If we take the best players out of it, BC's a best player in forestry, it'll just happen elsewhere.
If you remove all this timber from the market, isn't that going to make housing even more unaffordable in British Columbia?
Well, it certainly would. I mean, I guess we'll get our 2x4s from Finland and Germany, because they have very sensibly and rationally managed their forest assets in ways that we could learn a lot from. I mean, right now it's a timber supply gap is really the issue. We've got a lot of old growth that if we manage it well, we can continue to rely on a significant amount of old growth over the next several decades, while the supply gap of second growth ages into the size that it's harvestable. So right now we don't have enough second growth that's at that sort of sweet spot of 50, 60, 70 years old. We have a lot that's 30, 40 years old, but that's not worth harvesting. I mean, this is not true blanket across BC. There's a lot of original variants, but just generally speaking. So that's when you hear the forest industry talk about transition. That's what they mean. Transition out of old growth over time into that second growth. So if we just abandon the industry right now and say, well, we're not going to harvest anything because the Sierra Club says we can't, then those mills that are shuttered, they won't just be opened later in 30 years. There won't be the interest. The industry will have moved on. It's already moving. All the big BC-based forest companies are getting themselves into investments in the United States, whether in the southeast or down directly south of us. And they haven't pulled out of BC, but they're now de-risking their companies. I mean, they need to. Their shareholders no doubt expect that, so that they're not exposed to this kind of decision making. Which is, it's just terrible for workers in BC.
Back to the energy front, Quebecers are sternly against expanding pipelines from the prairies to eastern Canada to go through their territory to the Atlantic provinces where they have the refineries to process it. Well, is there a little twist of irony here about what's happened in the state of Maine?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of Quebecer friends. I observe that there's also a lot of Quebecers who have an unreal sense of where energy comes from. They are blessed with electricity that's pretty much 100% green because they have all that hydro, and that's about 20% of the energy they consume in their lives. The other 80% is from fossil fuels. But they have this sort of delusion that they are this green province just because they have 20% of their energy that's green. And so they think everyone should revere Quebec. And Quebec in that regard is actually no different than BC. BC's got about 95%, 96% green electricity. So does Manitoba. But Quebecers, seem to think that they are this special province because of that. And that's why when a decision like this happens, when voters in Maine say, no, we don't want your stinking transmission line, Quebec, it's bad for the environment, they must be really confused in downtown Montreal, where the self-glorification of energy delusion is at its greatest.
So the case here is the state of Maine says it would hurt their environment if Hydro-Quebec pushes high tension lines through their land where they hunt and fish down to states further south. A little taste of Quebec's own medicine. Of course, Quebec says they have a plan B to get around this, but Alberta thought they had a plan B when they financed the XL pipeline.
Yes, well, that's right. And, this harkens back to the Energy East debate. There was very strong support in Quebec for that Energy East pipeline. But when it came to decision makers, I think the, political sensitivities, the lack of backbone, when push comes to shove, Quebec politicians would rather get their oil from Saudi Arabia than Alberta. They're very happy to receive their equalization payments that are based on Alberta oil. I recently had a chance to, just in a chat I was having with a few policy wonks from Quebec, I made the suggestion, because we were having a bit of fun, everyone had to give it an example of a policy that they thought would be, a controversial thing to say. And I said, well, here's a policy. Quebec, with your moral grandstanding on Alberta oil, if you want me to believe that you're genuine in your moral position, I want you to stop taking equalization dollars from Alberta that are connected to oil. And if you do that, I will believe that you should occupy that moral high ground. And the reaction was not, let's dispute that. It was just incredulous. They couldn't believe that I would say such a thing. It was just beyond the realm of possibility that you would even think it. So I definitely won the prize of the most controversial thing that was said.
At the climate conference, of course, people are railing against liquefied natural gas, but doesn't liquefied natural gas replace coal in most cases?
Yeah, well, we're seeing China is increasing the amount of coal it burns. I noticed there must be some sort of PR campaign. Someone's probably hired, some big New York City PR firm, whether Greenpeace or China, to put the word out that China is on the path to greening itself. But the facts are different than that. I've seen this talking point show up in some CBC articles. It's like, what are you talking about? You look at the stats. Like China is burning more coal than ever. It's building new plants all over the country to burn more coal. And you've got this sort of PR thing going on to create the fluff thought that China is this sort of renewables leader. And, China's definitely doing lots of interesting stuff, and I hope they do more renewables, and, Godspeed to them for anything they do. But the fact is, that they are intensifying their reliance on coal, because when push comes to shove, they're not going to have less energy in the Chinese economy. They're going to have more, no matter where it comes from. If it comes from hydro, if it comes from nuclear, from solar, whatever, they're going to have more. They will never have less. That won't happen.
Well, a newspaper article just pointed out in China, because most of their power comes from coal-fired power plants, those electric cars in China are really coal-powered, not electrically powered.
Yeah, and there's this kind of, fatalistic thing on the part of the environmental movement that, only solutions that are perfect, that achieve all of the things we could want in our energy transformation journey, only those things are acceptable. Solutions that are not sort of perfect and don't achieve all of our things in one swell swoop are, if they're not doing that, they're not acceptable. And so that's why you see natural gas, which is 62% or something less emissions than coal, and is very easy to deploy into existing energy systems. It could be used right away today. It's abundant. It's relatively cheap. It's got all of these positives. Does it have some negatives? Well, yeah, it's not perfect. Okay, that's a negative, granted. But it's better than what we have. And so any environmentalist who looks at you and says, we have to oppose natural gas, because it's not perfect, they're not really an environmentalist. They're actually the problem.
The Canadian delegation to the climate change conference is the biggest delegation there, 300 plus people. How does that really match in with, hey, we're trying to reduce our carbon footprint?
Yeah, it certainly shows that there's an earnestness of the Canadian character where we want to be seen doing this. I do hope, I really do hope that sending a big delegation means that there are, bigger results and Canada is able to be an energy innovator, because it's that thing that's going to make us successful and be a template for the rest of the world to follow. And it's not going to be that we drop our conventional energy systems or our reliance on the resources that we have today. It's going to be that we adapt them and evolve them. That's why I say don't talk about energy transition. The transition to what? Talk about energy transformation if you want to be taken seriously, and be serious in your deeds, because we have to transform how we use oil and gas, and for that matter, coal, because it's 80% of our energy system. I know there's some people out there saying, oh no, we mustn't invest any money in innovation in fossil fuels. Again, those people are actually, they're not the main problem, but they're a big part of the problem. If they're trying to stop innovation, we need to have hydrogen from fossil fuels. We need to have carbon capture from fossil fuels. We need to have uses of chemistry and emerging science, like in synthetic biology, using breakthroughs in genomic science to find ways to handle these problems. And I'm actually very much dedicating myself to that innovation. I'm co-founder of a biotech startup that is addressing the problem of mining tailings waste. And given the huge increase that we're going to see in the need for motors and batteries in future, we have to make sure that when we mine the metals for that we're doing it in a responsible way. And our biotech solution is part of that. So that's what I call walking the talk. And when I see people, all they're saying is shut that down, or don't do this, don't do that, or you're bad because you think this is rational. I have no time for those people because they're not solution providers.
Well, there's always a gap. I mean, don't forget, between today's modern automobile, we had the horse, and that transition took, 60, 80 years?
Yeah, we have to accept that, and I think that's an unnecessary area of conflict. And, I would love to see a statement from our Prime Minister to make a statement. Right now, I'll read to you what Larry Fink says. He's the founder of the BlackRock Group, and someone who's pointing out that they're talking about divestment from fossil fuels. At the same time, they're investing in pipelines in Saudi Arabia for oil. What's with that? And even Larry Fink is willing to say this: we're fooling ourselves if we believe by restricting supply with our traditional hydrocarbon companies that only raises energy costs, which we're seeing now. And that's not creating a just transition. And he says we need to accelerate in a way that we're working with our great hydrocarbon companies. That's what Larry Fink says, not against them. I would love to see the Prime Minister of Canada take that sentiment, that thought, and start talking about it. I'd love to see the picture of the Prime Minister going to Fort McMurray, going to look at the innovation. You look at the Pathways project that, the biggest Canadian oil companies have gotten together. They've committed to reduce, just in the next 3 years, something like 60 megatons. That's a huge amount of emissions reduction. They're doing that. They should be our national heroes right now. And for some reason, this weirdness that has descended on all of these policy conversations prevents politicians from saying things that are true. They can only say things that result in nice polling results. And, that's destructive for the environment. It's bad for our polity and our economy and our way of life.
Just say no didn't work in the war against drugs, and just say no probably won't work with the environment either.
That's correct.
Stewart, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thank you, Jim.
My guest has been Stewart Muir, Executive Director of the ResourceWorks Society. His website, resourceworks.com. You can find him on Twitter at SJMuir. If you have any questions for Stewart, we'll ask that question for you if you send it to info@HowStreet.com. You can find us on Facebook. We're also on Twitter at HowStreet. I'm Jim Goddard. Thank you for listening.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.